801 in acreage for the south annexation. We'll take them one at a time just to be more concise. The south annexation sits south of Route 89A and east of State Route 89. You'll see the small circle sitting to the west of the main annexation area. Those two pieces of property are in the county, but are a part of the master plan. They're not proposed for the annexation itself, but they do play a part in the overall review and approval of the master plan. Roadway access to AED South comes via 89A off of the Granite Dells Parkway interchange. There's a southbound route that turns into Granite Dells Ranch Parkway. Granite Dells Ranch Road, pardon me. To the west is the Phippen Roundabout, which isn't depicted on the map, but it actually will be connected with Granite Dells Ranch Road at some future date. The future crossing of Granite Creek has been on the horizon and contemplated by the city of Prescott for a number of years. Those folks that have been purchasing homes in Granite Dells Estates and Walden Farms, their impact fees have been contributing to a fund to make the improvement of the future crossing of Granite Creek. I believe that this is a civil improvement project in Public Works next 3 to 5 years of planning. Mr. Giese has indicated that he would need that crossing to be in play by 2023 in order to be effective and provide access to the subdivision from that side. Here's the South Master Plan. This is the master plan that was reviewed by Planning and Zoning Commission and recommended for approval. As you can see, sections K and L represent the proposed eco resort. The natural open space all falls south of that and slightly to the west. And then the areas in what I like to call the chimney of the south annexation, the light beige color would be single family housing based on SF6 zoning. That means a minimum of 6,000 square foot lots. And sections A, B, and C are slated for multifamily housing. That's about 80 acres slated for multifamily housing at the very north end of the development. Let's touch on the north annexation. You can see that the relationship of the north annexation is very much, the airport is very much in play. In fact, the area at the end of our runway to the north and east encompasses about 400 acres of additional property that the city will receive if we complete the annexation process for these two proposals. There's approximately, I think, I won't go into the acreage, but there's about 400 acres at the end of the runway, which will be a tremendous help to the growth of the airport and provide stability for the future runway expansion. And again, Granite Dells Parkway interchange, which is pointed out on the map, will provide northbound access from Highway 89A. This is the North Master Plan. The housing component is to the south and east. Currently, based on information received from Arizona Eco Development, they're planning for plus or minus 775 manufactured home units. That would be in a rental village community where folks would actually rent the slabs but provide their own manufactured home. The balance of the housing in that area, plus or minus 775 homes, will be single-family residences that will be for fee simple title sale. You can see the purple area being the airport impact zone at the end of the runway. The natural open space running north and south basically follows the wash, and the Peavine Trail connection is through that area. And then the dark purple parcels are industrial general, and the medium purple parcel is industrial transition. The blue parcel at the very bottom is designated for municipal uses. So schools, fire stations, police substations, we sort of ruled out that in this scenario, police or fire would choose to locate there, but we would anticipate potentially a charter school going in that blue area. At this point, we're going to get into the comments analysis. Are there any questions from council at this time on any of the overview presented at this point?
Questions, comments from council?
I had a question, Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead. John, when you talked about public comment in the 60-day period, was that meant to comment on the development agreement solely?
Actually, the way the charter reads, the comments are on the annexation and master plan. There's no reference to the term development agreement or zoning in the charter. So my view is that the comment period is intended to, the 60-day comment period is intended to comment on sort of the big issue, the big picture issues, which the charter, the initiative. From the initiative, you can sort of infer that the big issues of concern were the annexation itself and this master plan. And so that's what the comment period is intended for. Again, I reiterate that the remainder of the issues, whether there are subdivision plats, whether the actual zoning, and the master plan kind of contemplates zoning, whether it's a PAD, development agreements, there's ample time through this process for additional public comment. The 60-day comment period, I think it misinforms people that that's the only time they can comment, and it's certainly not. There were comments before the 60-day period to the Planning Commission, and there'll be comments post 60-day period. Let me also make one other point on the master plan, this term master plan. The City Land Development Code has a master plan concept, and it deals with a certain type of zoning. I forget what it's called. When we use master plan.
Land area development.
Land area developments
AED.
have that master plan is a defined term that the Land Development Code uses. It's not the same as what the charter implies or requires. The charter requires sort of this two-dimensional master plan when it comes to the annexation, which is what you've seen in this application for annexation. It's essentially a single page, or in this case 2 pages because it's 2 annexations, that basically give you a broad overview of what the uses are and perhaps the densities. So there's a real distinction between what our Land Development Code describes as a master plan and what the charter, when the term is used master plan without any definition, what that means.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Rusi.
Thank you. I have a question for Bryn. I noticed that the amount of manufactured homes on the north parcel are now 775 instead of 1550.
The total number of housing units for that area in the North Annexation was slated for 1,550. They're dividing that between manufactured homes that are designed in a rental village type concept and single-family residences that will be for sale for fee simple title.
So it'll still be 1550.
It will be. Keep in mind that as part of the letter of intent and some of the deal was predicated on the fact that if AED wanted to move density northbound, that's the area that they would move it to from the South Annexation.
Okay, thank you.
I think you're good.
All right, so just to let you know, when we come back for future meetings, we'll take a much deeper dive into the land use concepts found within the master plan for both north and south. And we'll be looking at just taking a more detailed look at both annexation proposals. But we wanted to give you sort of the high-level overview for today so that we can get right to the public comments. So now I'm going to turn it over to Planning Manager George Worley. He's going to explain to you what people are talking about with regard to these proposals.
Thank you. So what's on the screen right now is a screenshot of one page of a spreadsheet that we use to track all of the comments and keep them in relatively common categories. So those are the comments. I think my presentation's done. No, I'm kidding. Nice try. We are going to go into a little bit more detail with some of the topics because a lot of them had a lot of comments. Want to point out that most of the commentors, when they submitted either by email or letter to us, hit more than one topic in their comments. So don't add the numbers up in these tables. They won't add up. 192 individual unique comments came to us. Within those, many of them addressed open space, archaeology, and again, we're not going to go through every single one, but we're going to hit most of the highlights in this. Open space, quantity, and quality were probably the number one of all the comments we received. Most of them address the acreage requirements that were either perceived as required under the original Save the Dells proposal of 500 acres, or the perceived difference between the LOI number of 475 and a perception right now that 11 acres should be discounted from that. And I'll address that a little bit later in the presentation. Most of those comments simply pressed for holding your ground, standing in for 475 total acres to be deeded to the city. We had a lot of comments about the archaeological sites and a desire to include those within the open space to further protect them. So the archaeological site, there's one in particular that's attracted a lot of public attention. That one is in the very south end of the South Annexation, and it is at or adjacent to the border of the developable single-family area and the natural open space area to be deeded to the city. So a lot of comments relating to that. We had a lot of comments, and most of them came in the second half of the 60-day period, wanting the development agreement available for public comment during this period. John has done a very good job of explaining that the development agreement was not a requirement of Proposition 400, and it will continue through the process. And we'll talk a little bit more about a couple of other issues that came out of these that appear to be misinformation or a lack of information to the public, and we want to correct that so that everyone understands the whole process.
Mayor Pro Tem.
And definitely, if you have a question, please ask.
George, can you have something, a hard copy of something you can give us?
We have been providing you copies of all of these, but I can get you a copy of
This analysis.
I can give you a copy of this as a hard copy.
I would
Yes, ma'am.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Protection of wildlife corridor within the open space area in the South Annexation was had a lot of comments. Don't build houses too close to the creek. The no-name creek that runs through is a wildlife corridor. It's known to carry a lot of wildlife activity. So a lot of the comments were related to keeping the development away from that. Water resources were generally, don't expend city water resources on more development. Most of these were generally considered, would be generally considered an outright opposition to the annexation altogether. Peavine Trail aesthetics, category is more of the view from the trail. So don't put the houses too close, put buffer areas along the trail to provide some buffer between the impacts of development and the enjoyment of trail users. Master plan insufficiencies. These were more focused on the resort area rather than the overall master plan. So most of these comments included some comment about the resort area and the associated zoning, which is a little further down, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. A lot of questions or concerns about housing character. So the housing character was mostly focused on the development in the north end of the South Annexation, the area that will fall between Granite Creek and Granite Dells Estates, that area that's in between Walden Ranch and Granite Dells Estates. It was concerned about small lot, dense development, which is kind of interesting because both of them are small lot and dense development. But there was an objection to more of that development occurring in between. We don't know how that will actually lay out on the ground when subdivision platting starts, if the annexation were to proceed. When subdivision planning begins, we will, from a staff perspective, as we do with most developments, suggest the planned area development approach to provide extra open space and allow clustering of development rather than a simple blanket subdivision. And some of that character question may go away as a result of that. A lot of comments, mostly from the area of Granite Dells Estates, on traffic impacts. It's very evident, looking at the maps that Bryn showed you a few moments ago, that the initial access to all of the development in the south will be through Granite Dells Estates. The roadway was designed that way. It was planned from the moment that Granite Dells Estates was annexed to provide access to this area or other areas for future annexation. The roadways are designed to handle the traffic, but it will be an increase in traffic in those areas, and there is some concern expressed about that.
So, George, can I ask a question?
Certainly.
So on that one where it talks about character of housing.
Housing character, yes.
I mean, those are pretty nice houses.
They are.
Modern
They're on
Farms
small
and Granite
lots and
Delta
denser.
Estates. So you're thinking that these comments were more that we want something like Hasayampa or,
I think the intent was less density and larger lot, perhaps. Some of the comments were specific to that, and you'll see, as Bryn noted, we've been sending them to you.
Right.
So every single comment we get in relation
Right.
to this is going to council for your consideration. Many of those comments were more focused on, don't put the same kind of development that we see in Granite Delta Estates adjacent to Granite Delta Estates. I don't know whether that's logical or not logical. Most people desire to see larger lot sizes adjacent to their properties, whatever the size of their property is. So that's something we see consistently, persistently through most public processes relating to zoning and subdivision planning. Everyone wants larger lots next to them, not the same size lots. So I think that's probably what this is more focused on.
thank you.
There were a number of comments relating to trail buffering. So this is the opposite of the trail aesthetic. So instead of the view from the trail, this is an effort to keep houses away from the trail for the protection of the property owners of those houses. So it works in conjunction, and the two overlap to a significant degree. If you buffer the trail, you buffer the adjacent development from the trail. So you're buffering the trail from development and development from the trail. Crossing the Peavine, we had 26 very specific comments. No at-grade crossing was the predominant one. Actually, it's a lesser number specifically than we anticipated because that has been a very hot topic and a very big concern. And I know council's expressed some desire to see specific types of crossings be explored. There was a number of comments regarding the 11 acres in the county, and this relates back to the previous page where we talked about the number of comments on general open space in the area. There is a persistent information out there that the 11 acres that are to remain in the county are somehow not protected as open space, even though they will be designated as open space on the master plan, which can include county lands. And they will be deeded to the city as part of that 475 acres agreed to in the LOI, and presumably that will end up in the development agreement. So those 11 acres are in fact protected open space and maybe usable open space, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. There was concern about the multifamily zoning at the very north end of the South Annexation. Because it is adjacent to Granite Delta Estates on one side and across the creek, Walden Ranch on the other, there was some concern about it not being compatible. One thing that I think needs to be remembered, though, is it is also immediately adjacent to industrial property to the north. And typically, multifamily zoning and multifamily developments, because of their ability to be flexible on buffering and parking lots and space arrangements, are considered good buffering between industrial or commercial development and residential development further south. So it made a lot of sense for the AED folks to propose a higher density multifamily even immediately adjacent to the industrial development to the north. There were comments relating to the resort and the SPC zoning, believing SPC is not the best zoning or that it's outright incorrect because it doesn't allow a hotel use. I do have a couple of extra slides in here to address a few of these topics, so I think I can answer the concerns about those. There were comments about the park development and how intense of a park it would be. Is it a parking lot and interpretive center? Is it a park with playgrounds? There were a wide gamut of comments about that, and as you read through those, you'll note that some are in favor of a heavier intensity use, more of a park setting, and others are, probably the majority, are more in favor of just an interpretive center and then access into a trail system. And then we had a number of questions about Proposition 400 specifically, which in fact is now the charter, not following the steps along that way, and it's almost all tied back to the development agreement not being available for review during that 60-day period. So again, it's something that I think the city attorney has addressed. We did a tally of the overall number of comments. So again, we received 192 unique comments. Of those, 169 of them were clearly opposed to some fashion or portion of. Almost none of them were opposed to the whole annexation, but they were opposed to something. They were opposed to the SPC zoning. They were opposed to the area of open space. There was something that was opposed to the presentation currently before council, the proposal currently before council. We had one who was absolutely flat out in favor of it, and that was not Jason Giese, I will tell you. I did check. Comments not clearly supporting one way or the other were, we had some that were just expressed concerns. We had one that I'm sure came from a sailor just based on the language that was included in it. I think we did forward that one to you for your enjoyment. Total of 192. Fairly significant comments within a 60-day period. We were pleased to see that many people comment to us.
I have a question, George.
Certainly.
Were you able to differentiate between the comments that were focused on the North annexation versus the South annexation? It appears to me that most of the comments that you reviewed here were really focused on the South annexation.
We didn't separate them out, but I can tell you from reading through all of them, because everything you've seen I've read, 99% of them were focused on the South. They were almost all relating to impacts on the existing developments down there or potential impacts on the open space or the type of development that would occur at the resort. A couple of things came out. In fact, I've listed four things came out, especially, and I apologize. In reading these, it's obvious that a planner made this list because these are all planning related stuff. There's some common misinformation out there. John's talked on a little bit of it, and I'm going to hit it because I'm not going to let him steal my thunder. But these things are important. The public needs to understand that some of the information that they're reading might not be accurate or fully accurate, and we want to correct those things when we can. The city attorneys talked pretty thoroughly about 60-day period. There's absolutely nothing in the charter that limits public comment before it or after it. This is a set period of time to guarantee public comment on the annexation itself. It's not intended to limit public comment. I don't anticipate there's anything, either any of the comments prior being ignored or any comments that you subsequently get being ignored. There's a lot of information out there that the SPC is the incorrect zoning for the resort. Many of the comments that we've heard or seen or read mention this. Partially by misreading of the land development code, I think some misinformation has gotten out. Hotels, which are specific to the use that's proposed, a hotel resort in that area, are not listed as a permitted use in the SPC zoning district if you look at the land use table. Nothing is listed in the land use table for SPC district. There are no permitted underlying by right uses. All of them require that you adopt a master plan that specifies the uses, and then that zoning district, with the weight of zoning law, only allows those uses you include in the master plan. It's not the correct or incorrect, it's the only zoning category that would work for what has been proposed in the LOI and presumably will end up in the development agreement to limit that use to only a hotel resort. So it is the only available and correct zoning category for that. So nothing is listed in the table for any other use, just to be clear about that, because that's an easily correctable situation. Anyone reading the land use table would see that. The 11 acres outside the annexation, but within the master plan. This one holds some special meaning to me because I am widely quoted in letters as having used the phrase open spacey in describing this at Planning Commission. I denied it until I listened to myself say it on the recording. So open spacey came out of my mouth while I was trying to describe in general various uses throughout the whole master plan area. The 11 acres is proposed to be part of the 475 open space acres in the master plan designated to be donated to the city, deeded to the city as part of that agreement that's specified in the LOI. That particular area is separated from the main annexation area by 2 streets, both county roads, and the city of Prescott's 89. So there's a county road that separates 2 pieces, and then there's 89, which is within the corporate limits, that separates those 2, the one piece from the other piece. And I'll show you a map in just a moment. One thing that I think has been missed is that while it's 11 acres over there, there's also another 6 city acres that we already own immediately adjacent to them. And it's obvious when you look at the map. So the area that are identified as AED, not highlighted in red, AED is part of the proposed annexation. Highlighted in red, AED, separated by the curved road, is the county area, and then across 89 is another county area. Because both of those areas adjoin the right-of-way of 89, which is in the city of Prescott, they could be annexed by us at any point in the future. The same with the 2 city of Prescott parcels south of there. I've been in touch with our Parks and Recreation Department. They have been negotiating with the property owner to the west of those parcels for years on potential for trails easements to make connectivity westward. And eventually, if you travel far enough westward, you end up with the trail system behind the Whispering Rock development. If you remember how important that was as part of its annexation, they provided open space and they provided trail connectivity over there. This is the other side of that and would connect straight through. There's also a perception in the public that this is a pile of rocks and it's useless. I can tell you parts of it are a pile of rocks and they're useless for active recreation unless you like rock climbing or scrambling. So the curved piece in the middle, probably not really usable for anything active, but again, it's open space and it's protected natural open space. On the other side of the road, very accessible. Potentially a trailhead there someday is certainly a possibility. And in fact, that's what it looks like from the road. The high rocks, the rocks very close to the road, are further south and on the opposite side of the street on the east side of 89. So again, this one is one that, in fact, it is usable open space and it should be protected.
So George, what was that acreage again of the city of Prescott property below?
It's 6 acres that we own in 2 parcels right now.
Okay.
And then 11 acres of this would be immediately adjacent to it or near it.
Thank you.
There's also a lot of information about the archaeological site, and the only way that the known archaeological site, I think we mentioned at some point that with the archaeological study that was done by previous owners before AED, there were multiple archaeological sites throughout the area, just as there were in Granite Dells Estates, and just as there were in Walden Ranch, and just as there were in most other developments in the north half of Prescott. The archaeological site is not within the open space boundaries that are shown on the proposed master plan. They're in an area that could be developed. It's within an area shown as single-family development. The parcels were studied. There is an existing master plan, archaeological study and mitigation plan on the books for that property. It has to be followed. It is subject to federal and state laws as well as our own requirements for that process. The preferred mitigation is avoidance. It always is avoidance with any archaeological sites. And one way to attain that avoidance is through planned area development style. So we're looking at the potential for negotiating with PADs, as we call them, and that's one of the ways that an avoidance could occur. Subject to that not working, there are requirements in the mitigation plan that they're going to have to follow regardless.
George, I had a question about the archaeological site. Have we had any correspondence or interest shown by the local tribe in and about this site? Have they reached out to us in the public comment period or at any other time?
Not that I'm aware of.
Expressing
No.
concerns about this?
No, sir. Generally, the way it works is if a site is studied and there's obvious information that might lead to the belief that there are human remains on the site, the tribe gets involved. If there aren't obvious results that show that, then as the development occurs and more specific mitigation is done, if that, again, human remains are discovered, the tribe is brought in immediately. So it's usually us reaching out to them, not the other way around.
As a courtesy, could we at some point do that?
Certainly.
And have the conversation with them to find out if there's anything specific that they may have a concern about, or is this a site that's on their radar that they want to see something specific done?
We can certainly do that. When archaeological studies and mitigation plans are developed, normally the consultant who's hired to do that will reach out to tribes if there's known connectivity per particular area. So I would be surprised if they haven't reached out to the tribe at the time they did this, but that's been a number of years ago, so certainly we can refresh that kind of connection. And that's basically the end of our presentation. Again, I want to emphasize the public comment period's still open. This is the statutory requirement by charter, but it doesn't cut off public comment. And every comment we get, we are forwarding to you, so you will have them. Members of the public can be assured that if you send an email, it's landing in council's hands.
Yeah, it's well stated, George, that this was just a guaranteed public comment. It's not, you know, we had hundreds of comments before the 60-day public comment period, and I'm sure we will continue to have people emailing us, and we will be looking at those emails. So good presentation. It's helpful to see it kind of categorized, if you will. Any other questions for George or Bryn here? Oh,
Could I just
yeah,
make
John.
a follow-up question or follow-up point? The 475, that 11 acres, just so it's absolutely clear that the letter of intent 475 included that 11 acre, those 11 acres. So that's always been 475. So this misconception that it's really only 463 is just, again, a misrepresentation. I think the other thing, George, could you address, when it comes to archaeological sites, there's a very limited disclosure as to who can get that.
Very.
So would you address that? Can you address that?
By state and federal law, both, the archaeological study identifying the location of any archaeological sites, especially any that may involve habitation, are very limited. It takes a special process to make them public. Generally speaking, the only time you see that is when it's public property. So you can visit ruins on public property because they've been mitigated already and those rooms have been preserved. Generally speaking, on private property, that's not the case. We get an archaeological study when a developer does one. It goes to our historic preservation person, Kat Moody. Most of you know or have dealt with her. She is the only person within the city's staff that generally gets a look at it. I can see just bits and pieces of them in relation to subdivision layout. They are not public knowledge. They should not be public knowledge. That's part of the Antiquities Act to protect those sites from the public taking, perhaps taking things from those sites or damaging those sites. So hopefully that answered it.
Anything else from the council at this point before we go to cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's pretty clear to me, and I've been advocating for the separation of these two annexations for quite a long time. Clearly, the public comments are, as you mentioned, almost exclusively focused on the southern annexation. But the northern annexation has many different aspects to it. The friendly condemnation of the land at the end of the runway, so the airport expansion and capacity can be increased in the future. The ability to be able to protect the airport-specific area plan from encroachment, development along the crosswind runway departure and approach areas, the acknowledgement of the airport-specific area plan and the impact of residential area within that area, all are very, very, very important aspects to that northern annexation. When we commingle cost-benefit analysis in one analysis that combines both north and south, I think it gives a unclear analysis of what each annexation's cost and benefits in the future will be. And I think it just reinforces my feeling, not necessarily feeling, but my strong advocation that we look at these as two annexations. They both qualify under the Proposition 400 and their size. They happen to be occurring at the same time. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be looked at individually because of the distinct differences in what they will impact the community in the future. So that's why I will continue to push for the separation so we can analyze each one, and not only while we make the decision on annexation, but as the master plans and the development agreements for each one go forward in the future, that we can monitor their appropriate development over time, so that the protection for both the South and the North will be appropriate. So I just wanted to make that clear, because that's the position I have taken and will continue to take. Thank you.
Any other comments from the council before we move on?
Yeah, Mayor, I
Councilman.
just want to ask the councilman, are you advocating for us voting separately on each annexation?
We will be voting separately on each annexation at the same time, even though the developer wants them to be decided at the same time, but they are separate votes.
They are separate votes?
Yes, let me clarify. The process for annexation, the rezonings, any other ancillary votes is separate. So you can't annex two parcels under one annexation ordinance that aren't adjacent or next to each other. So the south parcel will go through, or whichever on an agenda, presumably at the same agenda, because that's what the applicant's requesting. So you'd go through south parcel annexation, you'd go through south parcel master plan approval, south parcel rezoning, if there's subdivision platting, and all that, and then you go to north parcel, and those are two separate votes. I don't really want to touch on the development agreement, whether there's two or one, because that's kind of for a future time. But in all of the discussions we've had with the applicant, they're both contingent upon each other at this point. So in other words, if one fails and one succeeds, if north fails and south succeeds, or vice versa, the applicant has the ability at that point to pull the whole thing. So I understand Councilmember Good's concern about monitoring these, but and also point to the fact that when Planning and Zoning Commission went through, they looked at south in one meeting, and they looked at north the other, so they did look at them separately. This council could do the same thing. You could have, if you decide to go further and do more study sessions, you could focus and drill down into south and then drill down into north in whichever order, and focus on those. But at this point, it's my understanding of the applicant's position that if one fails and one succeeds, then the applicant pulls the one that withdraws the one that succeeds, and the deal's off. So it's a leveraging or a negotiation point that we're going to have to deal with as a reality.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's probably relevant here, since we're talking about the development agreement and negotiating, for the public to know that this council has designated 3 council members to negotiate on behalf of the full council. And those 3 members would comprise of Ms. Rusing, Ms. Scholl, and myself. So those 3 have been designated as the negotiating team, which can consider Councilman Good's thoughts in regard to the development agreement. And I hope to have that negotiation start in December. We'll see. We had a meeting that unfortunately didn't come together tomorrow, but in the very near future, I would expect that team to get with the applicant. We still have not seen any draft back from the applicant. We've been saying this, and it's still true, unfortunately. that we have not received a draft development agreement back from the applicant. So that's kind of the process. We'll start with that team negotiating, bringing it back to the council, the full council, and then once there is a meeting of the minds with the full council, then we would go to the public with that development agreement. It seems like that would make the most sense to have the council have the opportunity to negotiate it before we put it out, because otherwise what you might see today is going to be different after the negotiating team and the full council get to take a look at it. So I would imagine this will get pushed into 2021. I'd hoped that we would be able to get to it this year, but we're running out of time here, and we have not seen the development agreement. So we will keep moving forward as we can, and there's no real tight timeline on this. It's just a matter of doing it the right way. Can we move on to cost-benefit analysis at this point?
Mayor and Council, as you know, a cost-benefit analysis is an important component of looking at annexations of this size, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sarah Murley of Applied Economics, who has compiled and will be presenting the cost-benefit analysis for you this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Oop, a little shorter than George. Thank you and good morning, Mayor and Council. I wanted to walk you through the steps as far as the cost benefit and fiscal impact analysis. We are analyzing them in combination here. That was the direction of our scope. So the land uses are really fundamental to the results, and we have done our best to probe the developer for additional information where there wasn't clarity on the land use plans that were part of their previous submittal in terms of exactly how these different pieces might be used. And so, and the developers, we reviewed the assumptions and made some changes along the way. And so I believe that at this time, based on what's known at this time, that this is the best representation of how these uses might break out. So, of course, there's the resort hotel, which is a low-density, eco-friendly concept with approximately 200 casita-type units. Industrial, that's about 91 acres. 38 acres of industrial transition, which the developer envisions being used for mini storage and RV storage. The 156 acres of general industrial uses, which there's no specific information, but we're just assuming sort of normal industrial, similar to other industrial areas around the airport. As Bryn mentioned, there is about 20 acres of municipal civic use designated. In conversations with public safety, we don't anticipate that would be used for a police or fire station. So for the purpose of our analysis, we have assumed a charter school on that site. 571 acres of single family with somewhat different densities in the north and the south. That includes area in the south, plus there's an area in the north that is totaling 503 acres, of which 88 acres is anticipated for manufactured housing, and the remainder is put into that 571 acres that you see up there. And then the 80 acres of multifamily at the top of the AED South area. And then a variety of different types of vacant or open space. So there's the airport impact area out at the end of the runway, totaling about 399 acres. There's no development anticipated for that area. The Point of Rocks Preserve, about 475 acres that would be dedicated or deeded to the city for future maintenance. And then 503 acres of other open space throughout these areas. We looked at a 25-year time frame, which is traditionally what we have used for these types of cost-benefit analyses, starting with some infrastructure development in 2022 and extending through 2046. So the next step was to look at projected absorption, because we're doing impacts on an annual basis. So the timing of different types of development is important. The developer provided some timelines, beginning and end times for each of the different components of development in more detail than what is shown here. There's more detail on absorption in the actual report that you have. And then we work with the planning division to sort of refine the timing within those, the speed of development within those time periods, generally following sort of a bell curve of ramping up and ramping down. And so in general, looking at the residential development between 2023 and 2037, with the south area potentially building out a little bit ahead of the north area. The south area maybe 2036 is the assumption we're using, 2037 in the north area for single family. For the manufactured housing, potentially that's a smaller area and a fairly defined use, so potentially build out in 2032 for that, and then the multifamily building out in 2029. So looking at what the socioeconomic impacts of that mix of uses would be, we're projecting a total of about 4,400 new residents. We are assuming for the single family development that approximately 8% of those units would be held for seasonal use, which is consistent with the citywide percentage of housing inventory that is held for seasonal use based on information from the census. And so we're not assuming new residents would come out of those units. And that matters primarily for state shared revenues that are allocated to the city on a per capita basis based on residents. The employment uses are generally fairly low density, with the general industrial and the industrial transition being used primarily for sort of storage uses. So we're only projecting about employment of about 630 jobs at build out from this area. In terms of capital improvements, there are no improvements that would be anticipated that the city would fund. However, there is additional infrastructure that would be maintained by the city, and we're capturing those maintenance costs in our impacts. So we're estimating, based on information from Public Works, 48 lane miles of new roads, including 2 miles of Granite Dells Parkway in the south, and then 5 miles of combination of Granite Dells Parkway plus the primary north-south arterial through that southern part of the development, and then another 8 miles of residential streets and collectors in the south area. And then in the north area, about 9 lane miles of arterials plus 24 lane miles of residential streets. And so those are added incrementally along the residential part, along with the residential development, the arterials added ahead of development, since those obviously have to be in place to have access to both the non-residential and residential areas. The developer is also anticipating 3 acres of developed parks that would be maintained by the city, so we're capturing maintenance costs for that. And then for the Point of Rocks Preserve, we are anticipating $75 per acre per year for general maintenance that the city would need to do on that particular preserve open space. In terms of the fiscal impacts, we included the general fund, the water and wastewater operating funds, the streets fund, and then also, I apologize, it's omitted here, but the transient occupancy tax fund, since we have specifically resort development in this area. We look at revenues and expenditures from current and past budgets and look at, patterns by line item and develop rates and methodology for modeling each line item. In most cases, the revenues are based on, in many cases, they're based on population and employment, but also specifically for property tax, for example, we're estimating assessed value. For the resort, there's taxable sales. There's also taxes on leases, which we're assuming is from part of the industrial space, but also on the multifamily leases. There is lease revenue from the storage, the RV storage and the mini storage in the residential transition area, and there were also lease revenues on the slab rentals for the manufactured housing. For expenditures, those are based on a combination of population and employment for more general things, but for infrastructure maintenance, we're looking at the street lane miles, the public park acres, the level of water and wastewater use to estimate those expenditure line items. So we develop rates for each line item that we apply to the land use assumptions for the development. So this table is a little bit small, although it is also in the report, just showing the summary of annual impacts for each one of the funds. You can see that the overall net impact for the 25-year period for all funds combined is about $15 million, or net present value of $12 million. Each of the funds individually does have a positive net impact, although there are some negative annual impacts in the streets fund, and so we'll talk in a little more detail about that. In the general fund, the primary revenues are sales tax and state shared revenues. The sales tax from construction in particular is significant in the early years, particularly in 2024 through 2029, when the most development is happening. The resort, we're assuming, would come online in 2026, although you don't see a big bump up in that year because there's so much construction activity also going on during that time. But obviously that's a permanent addition to sales tax revenues. And then state shared revenues sort of gradually increase as residential development progresses out through 2038. And I will clarify, and I apologize, I meant to say this earlier, that although we are looking at a 25-year time horizon, we are assuming that the development could be built out by 2037, 2038. So the years beyond that are reflecting a build-out level of development. In terms of expenditures in the general fund, police and fire are, of course, the largest expenditures, particularly with that size of resident population. We're assuming annual expenditures of about $2.3 million for police and fire combined by 2046. Depending on the capacity available in existing stations in the early years, that could be less in those years, but at build out, certainly additional capacity would be needed. The only other sizable but much smaller expenditure line item would be for recreation. And so we're assuming about $120,000 in recreation expenditures relating to this new population. The water fund and the wastewater fund both show fairly small positive net impacts throughout the period. There are no capital improvements included here, which for this particular development, but we're looking at, and we're not including water-related impact fees as a revenue source in the water fund, but we are looking at water usage charges. We're estimating the level of usage, gallons per acre for the different kinds of development, and looking at the current water fee schedule and applying that to projected usage levels. And then for expenditures, looking at the cost for different per account for different kind of accounts. We were able to use the 2019 water and wastewater study that Raftellus Consulting performed for the city that had a lot of good statistics about revenues and costs for different types of water and wastewater users. Similarly, for the wastewater revenues, we estimated the gallonage for the different kinds of uses, and expenditures are based on the number of connections by type. In the streets fund, the primary revenues are from highway user revenue funds, which are distributed to the city based on population. And so those would obviously increase as the residential development in this area increased. There is also sales tax that currently goes to the streets fund, although that sunsets in 2035, hence the negative annual impacts, because there is maintenance costs for the 48 estimated lane miles of additional streets, and the HERF revenues, the Highway User Revenue Fund revenues, are not sufficient to fully cover those expenditures. And then finally, in the transient occupancy tax fund, the annual bed tax revenues with inflation are estimated about $671,000 a year by 2046. And those revenues are primarily used to support tourism and recreation. So, positive overall net impact, but obviously some minor issues with regard to street maintenance. And then, I already covered this, but then to close, the other thing that we look at is non-quantifiable impacts, so things that we can't fully capture in the analysis of city revenues and expenditures. Certainly in the north area, it's important for the city to protect the airport from encroachment and allow for any future runway expansion that might be needed. And so that whole airport impact area that is vacant around the north side of the runway and the northeast side of the runway is important to be able to, for the city to have control over that. Then also in the area of its topic of open space, being able to have that Point of Rocks preserve and the adjacent land and trails for people to use for recreational uses is certainly a benefit. This development does include industrial sites that support economic development, although it's certainly not the only industrial area available around the airport. There is a mix of housing and some higher density, lower priced housing and some multifamily housing that could potentially provide workforce housing in the future for those industrial jobs around the airport. And then finally, the unique eco-friendly resort concept that is proposed for this area that would bring additional visitors to Prescott that could spend money outside of the resort. So that concludes my presentation, but I am happy to answer questions that you may have.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you for this. I appreciate it. I think this is a very interesting slide because with this specific project, in my mind, some of the hard to quantify positive impacts are the most dramatic of the project in its totality. Is there a way that we could see an addendum, or if we were so desirous of having one, that made some assumptions about park and preserve visitation and direct and indirect economic impact? Because I think that would be very valuable information, not just for the council, but for the community. I don't know how the rest of you feel about that, but because the project centers so much on the 474 acres, I think it would be very interesting to know what that actually looks like if we can make some visitation assumptions. Is that something we could do?
That is certainly possible. There are assumptions that there's an Office of Tourism has for visitors spending in Yavapai County. We might need to modify those. The challenge, I guess, is to determine what share of people who use the trails already live in the city versus people who are attracted to those trails and come specifically to Prescott for that reason. And so we could certainly do some research and see what is available.
I just think the size and the scope of this preserve will make it a destination, and there could be some additional visitation impacts that probably a localized park wouldn't have.
Certainly a regional park, Michael, to your point, I think it is going to be a big draw in the state and probably even outside of the state. So it would be nice to make sure we're fully quantifying the ecotourism that'll happen as a result of this regional park.
Maybe we can talk offline about it. Thank you.
Questions, comments here on the cost-benefit analysis? Councilman Good?
Thank you. With the projection of all these additional housing units and occupancy of those housing units, I didn't really see a projection of how commercial retail services would develop adjacent to these annexation areas that would generate sales tax, TPT sales that would benefit the city. Have you considered that at all?
That is certainly something that we could consider, but we have limited our analysis to what is specifically within the annexation area. there will be purchases obviously made outside of that area because there is not regular, neighborhood retail within that area. But for based on what we have done in the past for each annexation area, we have only considered the uses within that area.
I'm curious that you projected water use by gallons per acre per day. That's generally not a statistic that we monitor very closely. What was the justification for that?
I had data in the Raftellus study that I was able to use for the residential, I had unit counts, so actually I could be more specific there. For industrial, it's very hard to say what exactly the users will be, and so we had to use some per acre numbers for that. But actually for the residential, we have specific information since we are estimating the number of units, and obviously the usage is different for a multifamily unit, for example, than for a single family.
Gallons per person per day?
Per unit.
Yeah. And any assumptions on how modern fixtures and many of our conservation efforts to make sure people are using low water use appliances and fixtures and our plant palette and those kinds of things, are they included in that?
I used projections from the Raftellus study, and I am not able to say with certainty exactly what their assumptions are as far as modern low water use fixtures.
So that water fund estimate could be pretty dramatically plus or minus.
Yes, but I would say that the revenues and expenditures to some extent move in tandem, so more water is used, more fees are collected, and there is more cost to provide that water.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very comprehensive. I have a few questions back to the street maintenance element. You mentioned 48 lane miles total, and then I got the north annexation has 20 lane miles residential. Do you have that number of how many residential lane
the
miles?
north area?
South.
Oh, south, okay. 8.
8. And one of my questions is, do you feel that if those streets weren't publicly maintained, if they were private, we have some subdivisions that are privately maintained, the lots have an assessment, do you feel that would be a positive impact on your cost-benefit analysis?
It would certainly reduce expenditures in public works for street maintenance if some of those were private streets.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments from the council?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for coming up. We appreciate that. So what I'm getting bottom line from this summary of annual net impacts is that revenues over expenses will be a positive $14,952,865 over the lifetime of the project.
Over 25 years,
Yes.
so things will continue after that, but we just looked at a 25-year time horizon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, John.
I actually have a question. When you looked at the general fund benefits, we see now the trend is online purchasing, and the city earns now, or I guess I don't know if earns is the right word, but gets sales tax from online purchases based on zip code. Is that, if you add those folks into the residential in the north, residential in the south, and then they do online purchasing, which obviously is the trend, was that calculated into your general fund calculation?
It was not, but that is a good point with, the change in the wafer change. And so in that way, the house becomes the point of sale effectively. And I will tell you, I think during this COVID period that online purchasing has certainly gone up. Prior to that, people actually purchased about 8 to 12% of their total retail spending was in online purchases and very focused in certain categories like clothing. But perhaps permanently, perhaps temporarily, we don't really know yet, that has increased. And I did not allocate those sales tax. This is, I guess, sort of a worst case scenario because I'm not allocating any sales tax related to resident spending. But that could potentially change the picture, yes.
So I guess then the follow-up question would be annexation versus not annexing. If you have the equivalent number of homes that go into the county, the city would effectively lose that online sales tax revenue if a development were to occur in the county or a different jurisdiction. That's a loss essentially against it. Right.
True.
Well, and it would occur to me that it's probably well north of 12% at this point in terms of the household spending online. We support our local businesses here in town, yet folks are really in tune to using Amazon and others online. So I don't know what that number would be, but it's well north of 12%.
Mayor, I did a little napkin math about population. Would you like me to share it or just keep it to myself?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Don't hold me to it, but So the assumption is the build out by 2027, which is a 17-year build out.
2037.
But you were looking at a 17-year as a potential, right? As the worst case scenario of rapid growth. I thought I saw that statistic in there.
We have most of the uses other than the resort and the multifamily building out in around 2037.
Okay, so forget my math then because it's going to sound good. But what I was saying is over a 17-year period of time, and now it's actually a 27-year period of time, it's 4,400 residents, plus or minus. When I was looking at it a 17-year period of time, you were looking at, if you did straight line population growth, which isn't what she had, but just assume it was 0.6% of growth per year. So if you did it over another 10 period of time, it's significantly less than 0.6% population growth over a 27-year period of time, 30-year period of time.
0.6% annual.
I was assuming a 2027, so I was off by 10 years.
Sounds like runaway growth to me.
Yeah. And then it's aggregate population growth of, if you assume that our residency for right now is about 44,000, easy math, it's 10% over a 27-year period of time. So you take the 10% growth, and if you did it straight line, it's really significantly less than 1% per year, specifically for this project, which I think is important for people to understand when they think this is a rapid expansion of the population of this community.
Fair enough. Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I just want to point out the resort and the transient occupancy tax, the bed tax, basically. I sit on the Tourism Advisory Committee, and I can tell you we do great things with that money. Not only do we promote tourism, we also promote nonprofits within our community that bring tourists in there. So I think it's hard to put a dollar amount on what all of that does, but this would be a destination place for people to come, not only because of the jails and whatever's going on in that whole open space area, but the quality of what this will bring great opportunities, I think, to our city through the bed tax. I just wanted to point that out because people that have heads in beds also eat, they buy. There's a lot that's going to go on as a result of this resort. So it's really a tremendous benefit in my mind. So just wanted to point that out.
Certainly be a destination resort.
Can I make a comment? Yep. Let me ask you this. People keep talking about commercial. Do you agree that you can't just pull commercial out of the air, and that's the reason why it's tough to really project what the impact of commercial may be?
So you're talking, I'm sorry, to clarify, commercial development that could be supported outside of this annexation area by the people that live in this annexation area?
Yes, well, commercial development within this annexation area that is zoned commercial, but that doesn't mean that ultimately, I mean, the market is going to determine that, not just because we've zoned it commercial.
Certainly, retail development is market driven, and you know, will proceed along with residential development, and it is you know, you can certainly help it along, but you can't specifically, it's market driven. There's only so much you can do to influence that. With regard to the residential units, it's somewhat difficult. We can estimate based on the estimated housing values and what the implied income of these people would be, how much they could have the capacity to spend. But whether they would spend that in the city of Prescott or in Prescott Valley or on Amazon or somewhere else is a very difficult distinction to make.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few observations on our growth. As you know, Arizona real estate's either boom or bust, and so it's kind of hard to predict an even, reasonable rate of growth. But, you know, not only do we have the AED development, we also have Granite Dells Estates, we have Deepwell Ranch, and these developments are a new model for our community. We are having fewer custom lots. These are mass-produced, mass-graded developments that seem like they go in overnight. We're approving phases in the hundreds now. And so to just limit our growth to just these 4,400 new homes, you got to look at the big picture because we have many other thousands of homes coming online from these other and future developments.
Councilmember Rusing, I think that's a good point. And I actually looked from 2010 to 2020, the community's grown about 4,400 people. So the growth rate has been about 10.7% over a census 10-year period of time. At the same time, Yavapai County grew by 13.4%, and so did the state. So our growth rate over the past 10 years is significantly less than the region, PV, and the state of Arizona.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilwoman Rusing, did you have another comment?
No, thanks.
Thank you. I would like to comment on that, and I pushed my marker before the mayor left. And so, Alexa, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and then we can have Alexa. A big part of our general plan speaks to affordable housing. Custom homes are not necessarily affordable to a lot of people that want to move and live and work and play in the city of Prescott. So, you know, I've been paying attention to house prices, and even those that, if you call them mass produced or whatever, even those homes are very nice homes, bringing lots of nice people to our area, and they're much more affordable than the custom homes. And so I think we just have to have an awareness of the multiple housing, and we need people that teach our kids, that work in our hospitals, that work in our city, have the opportunity to live in our city. So I think it's really important that we do as much as we can to bring the cost of housing down. You can't do that if you have 2-acre lots in our city and custom homes. So I just have to make that point. It seems to me, I've written it down here several times about there's this feeling of kind of an elitism that everybody has to be at this high level of living, and we don't want some of these other people next to us. And I just think that is, I just can't be quiet on that anymore. This is part of our general plan to do what we can to put some affordable housing so people that live here, that work here, can also live here. Maybe it looks like an apartment, maybe it looks like a smaller home, but we need to make that as much as we can to facilitate that. So, sorry to be so emphatic about this, but I think it's really important for Prescott.
Councilwoman Scholl.
Thanks, Mayor. I was just going to allude to the same thing. I appreciate, wanting to keep an eye on our growth and development and be mindful of that, but I I just am frustrated by this sentiment that we only want custom homes in our community. As a young person, as someone who was very lucky to be able to find my townhome and own it that I live in, it was literally by the grace of God that that happened. Otherwise, I would not be able to find a place to live in this place. And that's just frustrating as a young person, as someone who is hopeful to establish a family here. We can't expect young people to want to stay here and afford to stay here when a starter home is $500,000 or more. That's unrealistic. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind when we're looking at the development patterns of our community. We have to be mindful of the long-term longevity of our community, and that requires an active and healthy workforce. So,
Councilman Blair.
I once lived in a mobile home, and it was a nice home. And I will go back to tell you, as a part of history, our past mayor, Sam Steiger, tried to paint this community RA 35 back in the day when he was mayor, and it failed miserably. Our general plan does not call out large lots in this community. If you'll look down Mount Vernon or you look down Pleasant Street, they're all on 50 by 150 lots. They just happen to be historic at this point in time. But there were small houses built on small lots. And I look at Pine Lakes out in the county as being a pad-associated RV modular community. And you can't find something any better than that, with widowed folks that live there, with young families that live there, all kinds of folks that live there. Even though it's a 55 and older, there's some younger kids that are renting in there. We have to have a mix of employment. Otherwise, we don't survive. And that's why Prescott's always survived when a downturn of the economy happens, because you have a mix of every type of people that live in your community, not just the elite.
Councilman Sischka.
Thank you, Mayor. Just an aside, we always talk about being concerned about water consumption. Well, it's been stated on both sides of the issue. Yes, density is the most efficient use of water. Okay? So that's all I had to say.
All right. We only have about 30 some odd minutes left here. And, thank you so much for your presentation. And Sarah, I'm wondering, we only have a couple folks here in the chambers. What do you have online?
I have received 3 public comment cards from people in chambers, and I have 2 members of the public in the Zoom call that are raising their hands at the moment.
So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to give the applicant just a couple minutes here. I believe Jason Giese is on Zoom. And if you would want to make a few comments before we go to public comment.
Yep. Mr. Giese, I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
We sure can. Go right ahead.
Good morning, all. I'm in quarantine, so the reason that the meeting is canceled tomorrow is because of me. Hopefully by Thanksgiving, I will be done with Corona and we can get back to business. So I apologize for the inconvenience, but it is what it is at this point. My comments are real simple and I'll make it quick. The comments here this morning thus far, really as George read through the public comment that has been received over the last 60 days, are very consistent with the comments that we had at planning and zoning. So nothing new or unexpected from my perspective as we push forward. I think the one thing that I'd like to address directly would be Councilman Good's comment on 2 different annexations. It's true that John Palladini has painted the picture properly, that we've tied these 2 annexations together, and that's been the strategy that we've had for a couple of years now. the mayor made a comment that at this point, it's about getting things done properly or correctly. And so at the point that I'm healthy and free to move about the cabin again, I guess I'd say that we're not opposed to looking at the potential to separate the annexations. I would ask the negotiating committee to come forward with a proposal or suggestions for how that might work. It's not something it's not a no, that we wouldn't consider it. We'd look at it. I don't know how that would look. That's why I'm hesitant here. But certainly open to discussing it with the negotiating committee when we can get down to that level. Last comment, and then I'll turn it over because I know you have other folks that would like to speak today. As it relates to development agreement, the development agreement is a very detailed document that has to stand the test of time. The development agreement runs with the land. It is whether we own this property or 3 owners down the road, folks own this property, the property will always be subject to the development agreement. So no different than getting the annexations right, the development agreement has to be a document that is right, so that in the future, as I work through the actual platting of the subdivisions, there is an absolute guideline for the parties to follow. That's a concept that I'm very comfortable with. As you all know, we've not asked to be excused from the land development code of the city of Prescott. We haven't tried to write our own code. We're comfortable with the city's code. We're comfortable with water consumption regulation in the city of Prescott. And that development agreement is the document that will bind us and future councils so that it can be checked against, is this phase as proposed by AED consistent with the development agreement and the planned area development. That's a comforting fact for us on the private side, as well as the staff and the elected representatives of the city of Prescott, so that we have that North Star, the guideline, the contract that dictates our behavior into the future. So that's a long way of me saying we've spent a lot of time, a ton of hours on getting the development agreement put together in a detailed and organized fashion so that it is a very useful document and a user-friendly document into the future to prevent fighting, misunderstandings, problems that I know from experience in my career can easily crop up. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have for me.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Giese. Councilman Blair.
Mr. Giese, just a comment. I would never intend to hold your feet to the fire because that's not how I work. But is there some kind of idea when you might have this prepared document to come back to the city so that we can look at it?
Yeah, so Councilman Blair, the game plan was simply to meet tomorrow on Wednesday with the document and present it to the negotiating committee first. Because I tested positive for COVID yesterday, that plan got blown up. I'm going to tell you that I think it's best that we meet and discuss and walk through the development agreement with the negotiating committee on the first time around to make sure questions are answered and understanding and rationale for why it's put together the way it's put together is understood between the parties. And so I would say that the week after Thanksgiving, as long as I get a negative test when I'm done with quarantine, we would sit down and go through that process.
I appreciate that, Jason. And I will tell you, people are listening to you. They'll know what the laid out format of that is now that we have a team that's going to meet with you. And certainly we wish you a speedy recovery.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments for Mr. Giese from the council? All right. Thank you, Mr. Giese, for your comments. Appreciate it.
I just muted him, sorry.
Oh, that's fine. All right. Sarah, I think given that you have just a handful, 5 or 6 different comments online and here in the room, let's recalibrate and do 3 minutes per speaker. I had anticipated a lot more people, so that's why we had done the 2 minutes. But yeah, let's go ahead with maybe in chambers first and then your Zoom, and we'll do 3 minutes per speaker.
Okay, we've got it. The first card I have is Tom Rusing.
Good morning and thank you. I will say I did have prepared comments and have had to be modified slightly by the things I've heard, so bear with me as I work through this. I think you all know me. I'm Dr. Tom Rusing, Vice Chairman now of Save the Dells and a longtime resident of Prescott, 2194 Forest Mountain Road. My comments and those that follows reflect the analysis and opinions of the leadership of Save the Dells regarding the proposed Arizona Eco Development South Annexation. I request that my comments be entered into the minutes of this meeting verbatim. While I'm encouraged by some of the comments made earlier today, the majority of my comments, I think, are still pertinent. An informed citizenry is critical to the function of our city and our democracy. There are many citizens who feel the process by which the 60-day public comment period has been handled has been flawed, and it diminishes the importance of having adequate information during that time period mandated by Prop 400. To omit the draft development agreement in the planning and zoning proceedings was unacceptable. Commissioners stated publicly that was inadequate information to make an informed recommendation. It is critical that citizens have adequate information and time to analyze the details of this complicated development agreement and not the minimum. And I'm encouraged that the council has said that they will try to accommodate that. Once an agreement nears its final form, however, it is much harder to change. This process lacks transparency and erodes public trust in our city's leadership. I was encouraged by, or Mr. Giese himself alluded to the importance of the development agreement and also the complexity, and therefore adequate time needs to be provided to the citizens once that's released for them to make a careful analysis and comments to that. I will say that Save the Dells has been very disappointed to have been left out of the crafting of the development agreement. Our representatives met with city officials numerous times over many months and were assured that we would be included in the process as the DA was developed, and that did not happen. It seems strange to us that city officials ask us to the negotiating table, sincerely worked with us to come up with a compromise, and then completely let us out while developing the development agreement. It is very unfortunate that this has not happened. I was also encouraged by comments made by the mayor and council members about the multiple benefits of a regional park and preserve, which Save the Dells has been pushing for since the beginning. The benefits of health, recreation, economy, and preservation of our unique natural environment. And we look forward to working with the city to make this a reality. Save the Dells is ready to continue to help negotiate a win-win solution regarding AED's annexation that will satisfy the needs of the city, Prescott citizens, and AED. And while the time limit of 2 minutes was just increased, I will say in general that a 2-minute allotment for public comment is inadequate on an issue as important and as controversial as this. The city should embrace the concept of providing more information to the public and giving more time for meaningful input. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Roy Smith.
Thank you. My name is Roy Smith. I live at 1939 Rocky Dells Drive in Prescott. I'm going to continue from where Tom left off, and I'd like what I have to say included in the minutes of this meeting. Regarding the development agreement, since it is not publicly available, we can only make comments as to what it needs to include. 1, the letter of intent must be followed. The letter of intent was carefully negotiated by the city, Save the Dells, and AED, and it was stated over and over again publicly that the development agreement would closely adhere to the letter of intent. The 475 acres of natural open space in the heart of the Granite Dells must be deeded over to the city of Prescott concurrently with the approval of the annexation, with no possible lapse that could jeopardize its transfer to the public. Area K and L must be a resort or remain natural open space. The resort should be an environmentally friendly eco-resort that blends with the surrounding environment. There will be no increased density in the southern annexation and no transfer of water allocation from the north to the south annexation. That's actually number 4. Number 5, I keep forgetting to enumerate here. The southern border of Area 8 should be moved north to protect the Native American archaeological site. Homes in this area will be significantly degrade the experience of those using the trail, as has occurred in other parts of the trail. 6. The 11 acres that flank Highway 89 should not be included in the open space calculation, as they are not slated for annexation and would offset the recommendation in comment 5 above by trading one for the other. 7. AED's water claims to 375 acre-feet in Watson Lake must be transferred to the city concurrently with the annexation. Finally, the city of Prescott needs to listen to citizens and experts in the community, including Citizens Water Advisory Group, that's CWAG, and Save the Dells, to problem solve and come up with a solution to provide city water and sewer to Section 33 without providing water to large areas of county and state land north of Prescott. Providing water to county lands across the board is obviously controversial and undermines negotiations with AED. We suggest that the city reconsider a constrained water service area as opposed to the vast area in the currently proposed modification to the policy to provide water outside the city limits. Finally, city leadership has an opportunity to do the right thing by putting the interests of people of Prescott first and following through with the efforts that have resulted in the letter of intent. The citizens of Prescott are very concerned and interested in this annexation and are following the process closely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Matt Lavore.
Withhold comment this time. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I am going to allow Russell Pilcher to speak. You can unmute yourself, Mr. Pilcher. Mr. Pilcher, if you'd like to speak still, please unmute yourself.
Wow, that's too bad. I had a wonderful opening there, so I'm sorry you missed it. The city website under AED Annexation Agreement Next Steps specifically states in bullet number 1, the required 60-day comment period ends on November 14th. Now, if that's not true, that has been stated multiple times through this session so far, why not change that statement or elaborate so that citizens know the comment period actually has not effectively ended at all? To me, at least, and I'm not of the highest intelligence, but at least perhaps average, it's at least confusing to me. So I would suggest you might modify that particular comment on the city website. And finally, my sincere thanks to our police officer and 2 out of the remaining 10 sitting on the podium for demonstrating leadership, respect, and concern for their fellow citizens by wearing face coverings during this pandemic period. I really appreciate your demonstration of leadership. Thanks for listening to my comments. That's all.
Thank you.
All right, Leslie Hoy, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, Leslie. Leslie, please unmute yourself.
I clicked unmute and it, all right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I have two questions, which I hope someone will answer after I ask them. The first one is, what happens if in the development agreement, Mr. Giese decides he doesn't want to pay for capital improvements or specifies other adjustments that would impact the cost benefit analysis? Will the city or the consultant redo the analysis? I mean, not completely, but adjust the analysis before the development agreement goes to council? That's my first question. And my second question is, according to my math, the cost benefit analysis shows that there are, it was considered to be 1.7 people per housing unit. The city used to use 2.1 to calculate water use. So I'm wondering what the calculations are about the 1.7. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. And you could initiate an email to Bryn or George to get those questions answered. Thank you.
That's all we have, Mayor.
All right. I don't see any other public comment. I think we're done with the discussion here. John, anything else that you can imagine we need to?
Mayor, I guess I'll just make a couple of points and I'll reiterate, and this is sort of one of the inherent problems with sort of citizen-driven initiatives is that they may be well-intended, but they're written in such a way that potentially people misconstrue them. So the 60-day required comment period is just that. It's a required minimum. It's not like the Federal Register that has a 60 or 90-day comment period on proposed regulation and that it ends and then it's the public has no further ability to comment. The city's never worked that way. I think this council and other councils since I've been here have been very accommodating in terms of taking public comment and having as many study sessions as necessary before an item goes to a vote. And so that will, I'm confident that will continue on. And I will just reiterate again that the letter of intent, the 475 acres on the south parcel includes the 11. So if there's a desire or a demand that the development agreement mirror the letter of intent, the 475 is the 475. And to sort of argue that, well, the 11 shouldn't include and there should be another 11 added is the opposite of the development agreement mirroring the letter of intent. So you can't have it all. You can't have everything. You know, you have to sort of be able to compromise and work and negotiate a deal. And the letter of intent was negotiated. The 475 was very publicly shown on the maps and discussed as including that 11 acres. So unless through this negotiation process, AED, the applicant, wants to add additional land to the open space to quote unquote make up for the 11 acres, I think at that point, I would imagine that the city better be prepared to offer something in return for that ad. That's normally how these deals work.
Fair enough. Councilman Blair?
I just want to make one clarification or suggest that people understand that in the 20 years I've been here, no council has ever turned down an open space purchase in the Dells, never, ever. Matter of fact, we're working diligently on a couple of other pieces of property in the Dells as we speak. And collectively, along with other council people in the past, I've worked with the State Land Department to bring into the fold of the city of Prescott a regional park concept. So none of these things are new, and I just sometimes am taken back to listen to comments made by the public that we're not doing enough. And I take great offense to that. I also know the mission statement of Save the Dells originally was for 500 acres of land only. Now all these other stipulations that I keep hearing about what they want or what they demand sometimes puts me in the back seat as well. From my standpoint, this is about preserving and making the beauty of this community go forward and not about nitpicking stuff to death. So just had to say that because the bottom line is I hope Save the Dells gets their land, 11 acres outside the city. Who cares? We're going to get a great piece of property for a trail easement. We have Goldwater Lake that doesn't sit in the city of Prescott. It's in the county, and a great asset. So to draw a distinction to whether it's in the city or not is ridiculous. So those are just some of my basic comments.
Very good. If there's nothing else from the council at this time, this meeting is adjourned.
Is it downstairs? Are we downstairs?
Downstairs.